Hi, in today's video, we're going to be talking about some of the different forms of selection criteria and how to address them in your medical job application process. We'll also be talking about what to do when there are no apparent selection criteria. And finally, I'll be giving you a little technique for how you can demonstrate your best evidence in meeting selection criteria. So let's get into it. Hello there, I'm Anthony, the Career Doctor. We make videos for both medical students and doctors in all points of their career, particularly focusing on career challenges like job applications and being a better manager in medicine. It's a busy time here in Australia and New Zealand. It's what we call the start of the peak medical recruitment season going on at the moment. Lots of medical students putting in their application for internship. That's really getting quite busy at the moment. We've got Australian medical students having to put their applications in 2 days' time, and then in New Zealand it's Friday next week, I understand. Following on from that, we've got some of the RMO recruitment campaigns opening with the application portals, some of them already being open. And in a couple more months, we'll be getting into the interview season. So it's quite a busy time for both the medical trainees applying for those next jobs, as well as those involved in the selection process. I'd like to, before we get stuck into this video, encourage you, if possible, we'd love you to subscribe if you're finding these videos helpful. So turn on the subscriptions, tell your friends. Also, turn on the bell for notifications so you can be let known when there's a new video coming through. I try to do at least one a week, normally Friday, 10 o'clock Sydney or Newcastle time. Hoping to get this one out a little bit earlier because there's that deadline on Friday for intern applications. Also, some comments and thumbs up and thumbs down would be great. At the end of the video, I'll be telling you about a Facebook group as well that I support, where we have a number of medical students and trainee doctors asking questions around job skills issues. And that may be something you want to consider to join as well. We'll paste I put a link in the video description below, because you can suggest through that group some ideas for future videos. So as I said, I've had a lot of questions through that group and elsewhere about this issue of other types of selection criteria, particularly when people come across this issue of essential versus desirable criteria. Also, I was a bit surprised to understand this, but apparently there are some jobs where there are no apparent selection criteria. So in today's video, we're going to talk about that, the difference between essential and desirable criteria, and then what you might do if there are no selection criteria. And then finally, I'm going to finish up with a little bit of a technique for how you can provide evidence to justify selection criteria using something called the CAR technique, or some other people call it the STAR technique. So stay tuned and stay on the video to the end for that, because I think you'll like that. So in the last video, I talked about selection criteria, but I didn't actually tell you what selection criteria are. Possibly I was thinking that's a bit obvious, and look, it is kind of obvious, but really these are the basis on which you're evaluated for your suitability for the job. So these are criteria against which we gauge your suitability and rate your suitability. Particularly, sometimes it's about you in terms of being suitable for the role, when it might be a situation of low candidates to a high number of jobs, but often it's also a case of, well, where do you sit against and rank against other candidates? So they really should be the only criteria that you're assessed by. Of course, the problem with a lot of these position descriptions, particularly in the public sector, is there's lots of other information. And yes, some of the other stuff like the role description and the reporting requirements and the challenges may come into it, but it really should just be informed by the selection criteria. So that's okay when there's like 6, 7 or 8 just selection criteria. You kind of know what to do. You've got to address each one and spend some time on them. But what about this thing about essential versus desirable criteria? So you do see examples of these. They are going out of fashion, but I've got an example for you to show you shortly. But what is the difference? Well, look, it is as it probably pretty much sounds to you. So you've got on your left there, you've got essential. So these are kind of the must-have. If you don't have these, if you can't provide the evidence for these, then you're probably not going to even get through what we call the culling phase, where the applications are reviewed and people are assessed to go into the interview. So you really have to be able to demonstrate them. And if you normally can't, it rules you out, usually at an early stage or possibly at a later stage if at, say, the interview, you've found a little bit missing on them. Versus then we have on your right there the desirable criteria. So these are kind of like the nice to have. So it's not necessarily the case that if you don't address these that you are ruled out. You could still make the cut. So that's essential versus desirable. So why might some people prefer essential versus desirable? Well, look, I think probably the main reason might be that it helps. It seemed to help to discriminate between candidates. So if you've got a situation where you've got lots of candidates vying for a few number of jobs, and you're finding that most of them are addressing the essential criteria, you might want to set some desirable criteria that give you a little bit more wiggle room to make discrimination between candidates. So that might be a reason. However, there's some problems with having two types of selection criteria. Firstly, it can be confusing for the candidates. So, you've got essential and desirable. Which one do I focus on? What if I can't meet a desirable? That sort of stuff. So that can be confusing. Also, it can be confusing for the interview panel. What happens if you've got someone who, just meets all the essential criteria in your mind, but does really well on the desirable versus someone who's really good on all the essential criteria, but's lacking in one or two desirable? What do you do then? And I think the main reason the desirable criteria are really going out of vogue and seen as not being best practice is that they're often not well linked to what is called a key result area. So they're not criteria that are speaking to the day-to-day nature and the important parts of the actual job. And so if you go through this process, which is called a job analysis, as part of developing your selection criteria, you often find enough essential or key criteria that you really don't need to go to the next level in terms of desirable. So they tend to not be recommended anymore. And the recommendation tends to be in policies and best practice is just to have selection criteria. So I do have an example of essential versus desirable to show you now. So let's go have a look at that. Okay, so this is a job description from the Western Australian Health Doctors Job Portal. It's one of many. It's based on a Mercury system, which does a lot of the recruitment, e-recruitment sites around the country. And you can see this is a registrar service psychiatry job, and you got sort of it's a fairly nicely laid out job description form with key reporting relationships, etc. Function of the role. We can see a brief summary of duties. Brief. There's a little bit of an oxymoron there, I think. And then we come down to the third page and we've got our selection criteria. So we've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 selection criteria and 2 desirables. So interestingly, it's eligible for registration by the Medical Board of Australia, as we've seen in previous videos. That's pretty much a yes or no. Demonstrated clinical skills and relevant experience working with consumers with mental health presentations. That would be one where it would be fairly easy to supply evidence for if you have worked in psychiatry before. Demonstrated experience and ability to work effectively as part of a multidisciplinary team. Again, that would be incredibly easy for most people who worked in the Australian health context to supply evidence for. Demonstrated effective communication and interpersonal skills. I will be doing a video about this at some point. I see lots of job descriptions with things like demonstrated effective communication and interpersonal skills. How you assess that, don't really know. It needs to be a bit more contextualised to the job role, I believe. And demonstrated organisation and time management skills. Well, I guess you could set a task within the interview or selection process to test for that, but very few processes do. And then we've got the desirable selection criteria, and this is interesting because knowledge of Western Australian Mental Health Act and other related legislation. So I guess that's in the desirable column because they might be thinking people are applying from elsewhere where they're working in similar environments but with different legislation. So for those who are not familiar with the Australian context, we're a federated system, so lots of laws are actually based on a state level. So there are similar mental health acts and other laws in other states and territories, but it would be unfair for people to expect people from those locations coming to WA to know the specifics of the Western Australian Mental Health Act. But you could develop that into an essential selection criteria around the basis of knowledge of Mental Health Act legislation and the ability to apply them and other related legislation. Similarly, we've then got current knowledge and commitment to equal opportunity in all aspects of employment and service delivery. I've got to ask the question why that's desirable. I've got to ask the question why that's actually not a requirement of the job, and why it's even in the selection criteria at all. So there's an example of essential and desirable selection criteria. Okay, so just a little divergence before we get into no selection criteria. I thought it'd be useful for me to talk about how selection criteria should be developed. Bearing in mind this may not be always the case. A lot of medical jobs are done this way now these days, but a lot probably are still recycling old position descriptions. But there's 3 steps for developing key selection criteria. And you can see here up at the top, we've got this thing called the job analysis. So what that's about is actually reviewing the key requirements of the job. And how do we do that? Well, before we put up the new position description every year, we should always have a look at what's happening in the job and see whether things have changed. The best way to do that is to actually talk to those in the job currently and also those that work around them. And by doing that, you can quickly come to identifying these things called key result areas. So things that are done by the person in the job on a regular basis that are really important to the job, that kind of make or break success in that job. So what would be an example of that? So a key result area for an intern might be completing discharge summaries effectively, versus a key result area for a registrar might be being able to balance the priorities of the consults versus the ward patients versus the calls to the emergency department. So after you get those key result areas, the sort of success factors, you then finally come to developing selection criteria. And these are basically statements that help you to work out if someone has the ability to demonstrate those key result areas. As I say, not always the way that selection criteria are developed in medical trainee jobs, but this is kind of best practice and the way that they should be developed. And this again is useful to know when we come to talk about how you can demonstrate evidence. So then there's the question of, what do I do, Anthony, if there's no selection criteria? I was surprised to find that there are some jobs that don't actually have selection criteria that are evident. It was pointed out to me by some New Zealand medical students and trainees that in particular in New Zealand, often there are no formal selection criteria for jobs. And I think the reason for this is that often it's a situation of the person's actually got the job contract already, and it's more of an EOI, expression of interest process, for being a certain trainee within that job. So the position descriptions are slightly different, and I think that's okay, and I think there's lots of good things about this thing called the Mecca in New Zealand, where you essentially get a 10-year to train contract, which sounds great. So what should you do if you get a job where there's no selection criteria? Well, my first suggestion would be to review other parts of the position description as well as other bits of the application process. Maybe there's a CV template, maybe there's other documents, maybe there's links, maybe there's something in the ad as well that talks about what's looked for in the role. Often if you look at the job ad, there's kind of, this is what we're looking for, this is not, maybe even this is what we're not looking for in the job ad. So there may be other ways of inferring selection criteria by looking through the other documentation, and you can kind of come up with your own selection criteria. The second thing to think about is, and I think this is particularly the case in the New Zealand example, is this a training position that you're applying for? Is it a job that involves being a member of a trainee in a particular college? Well, if so, then go and look at the college training requirements, because there are often requirements for suitability for trainees at various stages, and they can be seen as selection criteria as well. And then you can think about how you address the evidence for those. Then, as I pointed out in the previous thing about job analysis, go and talk to some of the current incumbents and ask them, what are the 3, 4 or 5 key things that you have to do in your job? What are the things that your consultants in particular, because let's face it, often it's the consultants on these panels, measure your success by? They can become your key result areas, which can then turn into selection criteria. And finally, talk to the job owner, the person that put the job up in the first place. This might be like a director of training or maybe a JMO manager. Whoever they are, though, they're likely to know a little bit more about what's being looked for, and they can help you out with that. So there's some tips for what happens if there are no selection criteria. Now let's go and look at an example. Okay, now we're over here at the ACE site, which stands for Advanced Choice of Employment. And this is where you apparently apply for your RMO positions in New Zealand. It's a nice fancy looking website, lots of good information here, explanations about how ACE RMO works. Essentially, it's a portal for New Zealand trainees, and you can see here information for Australian graduates. So they encourage Australian graduates as well to apply, and so this is how you apply as an Australian graduate. You need to have the registration standard. There's some resources to look through, and there's a referee requirement, along with academic transcripts. And they even allow people to start late, because in New Zealand the academic year, or the commencing year for internship, commences a little bit earlier. It's actually before the start of the next year. So, but the thing that's absent from this whole process is a position description. And so to complete your application, you need to have a CV on a template. You need to have a CV, and you can use the template, I should say. I wouldn't recommend you do it because it's not a great looking template, but you should definitely look at it in terms of the information that's required. You need your academic transcript. You need a recommendation from your dean or your clinical results, copies of to establish a residency or citizenship, and then 3 referee reports. And you can supply a cover letter. So this creates an issue because there's no position description. How do you sort of, address it in a cover letter? Well, I guess that's not completely possible. But there's no actual position description there. And so there are a number of sites where you can apply for jobs in New Zealand, and here's one. And so you can see here is an expression of interest 2018 training year house officers, house officer Auckland region. I've got to say the New Zealand websites are probably look a lot better than the Australian ones. And there's some information here about working as a house officer, vacancies and runs, etc. Register your interest and apply now. Link to required documents. So you have to have things certified or notarized. Have a CV. Again, there's a template. Again, I wouldn't recommend using formatting in that template. ID of your passport, your driver's license, police certificates, stat decs, evidence of current appointment, etc., etc. Update your CV, contact your referees. But again, there doesn't seem to be a position description of any sort. The issue here is that doctors already employed as trainees in New Zealand already have a job, and I think that's a good thing. There's kind of this concept for training tenure. So really, the selection is a slightly different thing. It's about what you want to train in. Okay, so I also promised at the end to give you a bit of a tip and technique about addressing selection criteria. So we're going to talk a little bit about the CAR technique, or what others call the STAR technique. And they're essentially the same. I just use the CAR because one less letter to remember. So you can see that STAR on your right there refers to situation, task, action, result. So and then CAR is context, action, result. So context being, what was the situation you're in, what was your role, what were you asked to do, basically. Action being, what did you actually do, what was your behavior, what sort of things did you undertake. And then finally, the R is the most important here, because it's what was the result of that activity that's important. And as I said, some selection panels, particularly at interview, might be using this mnemonic in terms of rating your responses to questions. So it's worth knowing about. So an example of using this to address selection criteria, let's say in your cover letter or maybe online application, might be as follows. So in my example here, we've got an SRMO job. I'm using the New South Wales language, but senior house officer elsewhere, I guess. And most people going for that job might be an intern or resident, I guess, so someone stepping up to that role. And let's say in the selection criteria, there's a selection around communication. That's pretty common. And they've got this criteria that says able to demonstrate high-level communication skills through thorough documentation and clear patient communication. Okay, so how might you go about addressing that in a CAR format? Well, you might talk in this way. So the example I'm giving you here is, in my most recent role, I was central to the quality of the discharge communication process. So there we are. We're summarising this selection criteria and giving the context. We had a number of patients from a non-English speaking background. So there's your context. There's your situation and your task. Now we move on to the action. So and it's good to use personal language, the things that I did, I ensured that the key components of the summary were worded in language that could be understood by them and as part of my process of discharge planning. I also ensured that an interpreter and or family, there should be a member there, apologies for the typo, were present when going over the discharge plan. So there's your action. Finally, the result, and this is crucial. This led to positive feedback by the patient's family and my consultant. Now look, that's loose results, I acknowledge, but often it's not possible to get down to really hard edge results, and good feedback, whether it's in that context or let's say, for example, you might be complimented by a GP if your discharge summary in this situation is good. You're not often going to be able to say, and later on I found out there was a 10% reduction in readmissions in the next 28 days or something like that, which would be great if you could, but not always possible. So there we've got a context, action, and result response to that selection criteria. So you can use that in addressing any particular selection criteria. So look, thanks for watching today's video. As I said, we're trying to get as many of these types of videos out at the moment around the job skills process to help you trainees and medical students. Please subscribe, please turn on notifications, please give feedback, please give thumbs up and thumbs down. I will post a link to our Facebook group where we've got about, I think, 55 members or so. Actually, you might go and have a look at that now. So here's our book on Facebook. We've got actually, well, 62 members now. So a sort of a growing group. We only started this about a month or so ago. You can see in the discussion, we've got lots of questions from other students about things like medical CVs. I post lots of info. Usually I try and post links to the YouTube videos first, so this group gets to see it first. And we're finding it's very helpful, and it helps me to understand the sort of things that you guys might want in future videos. So I'll post a link to that in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video helped, and bye for now.